Tell us
Isn't that something? So the Hebrew language is actually God's language. They didn't create that on their own. God gave them that. Okay, and within God's language is such a depth and richness that is just so many layers. And when you study the Hebrew language, each individual letter of the Hebrew alphabet has a corresponding picture, meaning for each letter. So like we have the letter A. Their first letter would be Aleph. Our letter A doesn't have a picture meaning, but their letter Aleph has a picture meaning along with it. They also have a number attached to it that gives meaning to it. But when you look at the Hebrew word for to heal, it's the transliteration, and we would pronounce it Rapha. That's where we get Jehovah Rapha from, the Lord my healer. Okay, and so that word Rapha means to heal. Now when you break that down in the Hebrew, it's 3 letters. Resh, Pei, Aleph. Resh, Pei, Aleph are the 3 Hebrew letters used in the Hebrew word for to heal. Okay? Now when you look at the first letter, Resh, it's a picture of a head, and it means to think something. The second letter, Pei, is the picture of a mouth, and it means to speak something. And the last letter is Aleph, and it's a picture of an ox or a bullock, which speaks of the strength of God or the sacrifice. And so when you combine the pictures together, the meaning you would get of the word to heal or Rapha is to think, speak the sacrifice. To think, to speak the sacrifice. Okay? So what it's saying there is, the way in which we're healed is for our hearts to be filled with the sacrifice, and for our mouths to be filled with the sacrifice. Right? And so communion is a picture of us thinking about the sacrifice. And not just that Jesus died, but what does it mean that Jesus died? Right? Because there's power behind the meaning. Now, if we have our understanding of the meaning behind why Jesus died crooked, then we can speak the sacrifice and think it all day long. It's not going to have any power in our lives. For example, if we think the sacrifice was about God being angry with man because of their sin, and He needed an anger management program, and Jesus was His 12-step program to be delivered from anger, and that's what we think when we think of the sacrifice, that's not going to have any power to heal us. That's not going to have any power to heal us. But if when we look at the sacrifice and think and speak the sacrifice, we see that the sacrifice is telling to us that we're dead to death. The death that was reigning over us has been conquered. That we're dead to the life that can be held down by this world. That the life we have has now passed out of the world and has ascended into the heavenlies at the right hand of God. When we can see that, when we think and speak the sacrifice, that has tremendous power to heal us. So Resh, Pei, Aleph, think, speak the sacrifice. When you take communion, you're not supposed to be thinking about your sin. You're supposed to be thinking about the body and blood of Jesus and what that declares. Okay? And so think, speak the sacrifice. That's why Paul said that every time we gather together and take communion, we're declaring the Lord's death. And what does the Lord's death declare to us?
We're dead to death.
We're dead to death.
Right.
See, human beings have been so consumed with their own works, we don't even know what the gospel was really about. We didn't need to be saved from being evil. That's not why we need to be saved. Jesus didn't come to make bad people good. He came to redeem a treasure who is now enslaved through death reigning over them. Okay, it says we were in bondage all our days through the fear of death. And so God came to save us from death. That's what He came to save us from. And if we could see that He died away our death, it wasn't just Christ that was crucified. We were crucified with Christ. The death He died wasn't His death, it was our death. And so when we behold Him dying on the cross, we're beholding Him taking our death and dying it away and bringing it to the grave. And then He come out of the grave with life and no death. He left our death in the grave. You guys see that? He brought a plague to our death. He brought a corruption to our death. Now, death has a powerful impact in the heart of a human being, because whenever we see corruption or death, whenever we see the fruit of death, or whenever we see the works of the flesh in our life, those things try to speak a word to us that tell us we're separated from life. Now, this has a powerful effect in the human heart, because if we think we're separated from life, we're going to try to get it. And we're going to do everything we can to get it. Right?
Yes.
So what God had to do was, He saw our consciences were stained with sin, and the wages of sin, which was death. Now He needed to come and purge our conscience from sin and the wages of sin, which was death, so that our consciences could be cleared from death and we could be persuaded that we're not separated from life. That we're alive to God in His life. We're intertwined, we're braided together with the life of God. Now, when your heart becomes persuaded that His life is your life, then what happens is you become healed. You become healed from all kinds of things. Your heart becomes healed first and foremost from the fear that's in the world through death. The fear of I'm separated from life. The fear of I don't have what I need to have life. You ever felt like you don't have what you need to have life? How'd that feel on the inside? You ever feel like you were separated from what you needed to have life? What did that do on the inside of you? Anxiety. Do you know what that's trying to do? It's trying to compel you to enlist your members to give yourself life. So when we can see that we're dead to death, we died with Christ to the life that's in the world. The life that's in the world is the life that was in bondage to death. There's a life the world can give you. That life isn't eternal. That life is corruptible. It will perish. It can be corrupted by moths and rust. That's why Jesus said, store up not for yourselves treasures on earth, where moth and rust can corrupt. But store up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where neither moth nor rust can corrupt. What is He saying? Listen, man, don't set your affection on the life that's in the world as if that is your life. But set your affection on the life that is seated in God, as if that is your life. Because if your eye becomes single, fixated on that, how great will the light be inside of you? Right? And so when we see that we're dead to death, when we see that we're dead to the life that's in the life that's in the world is not our life. It couldn't give us life to begin with. Did anybody see the life in the world cause a guy to live forever?
Nope.
You guys know Solomon had everything you could ever have in the world, right? How many wives did he have?
Gazillion.
I don't know if that's a good thing, but he had a gazillion wives. And that's not a disparaging remark about ladies. I'm just saying, I don't know if that's a good thing. But some guys think, man, if I could have more than one, you know. Solomon did everything. The Ecclesiastes is basically an account of a man who was the wisest man in the whole world and that accomplished everything that could ever be accomplished at the highest level. He was the greatest doctor, the greatest architect, the greatest philosopher, the greatest teacher, the greatest husband, the greatest man, the greatest... all those things. Now, at the end of the day, did those things keep him from the grave?
No.
So the best life a person could suck out of the world still ends in you in the grave.
And him calling it futility.
Futility. This is what I've learned. Bless God. Love God.
Yes.
What is he saying? Believe on God for life and not what you can do in the world. Right? Now what happens is when we see we're dead to that life that's corruptible. Guys, this life in the world is corruptible. And if we look on that life as if it is our life, it will fill us with fear and anxiety. Once the fear and anxiety sets into place, it will fill our conscience with laboring and toiling to try to get the life we say we don't have. And then once we enlist our members to labor and toil to try to have life, guess what happens? This flesh doesn't possess the ability to bring forth life. So when we try to bring forth life through our own works, guess what happens? The works of the flesh manifest. So, Resh, Pei, Aleph. When we think, speak, the sacrifice. When we see what the sacrifice is declaring. When we see that life is not contained in the flesh or in the world or in our works. We'll stop looking to those things for life and we'll start looking to the Spirit of the living God for life. That Spirit can't die. That Spirit created the whole universe. That Spirit even took a guy who had all sin and all death on him and pulled that guy out of the grave. And didn't just leave him there, but ascended that guy into the right hand of God. Now, when we begin looking on that, what happens is our hearts are healed from fear. Perfect love replaces the fear and the torment that was in our hearts. So our hearts first get healed from fear. When our hearts get healed from fear and we become persuaded that we already possess all things that pertain to life in Christ, then our conscience is washed clean from laboring and toiling. When our conscience is washed clean from laboring and toiling, our souls are restored to rest. Our souls are healed now. So we have our heart healed from fear, washes our conscience clean from our works. That heals our souls, brings it back to a state of rest. When our souls are restored to rest and the fear can be healed from our hearts, our flesh goes to rest. Our members go to rest. And if our members go to rest, then our flesh is healed from the works of the flesh. You know, every work of the flesh that manifests out of us is the result of us looking to something in the world to try to bring peace and rest to ourselves. That's the result. We feel so subverted by our pain, by the perception that we lack a good report. We lack acceptance. We lack validation. We lack. And that eventually will press in on us so bad. We'll feel so much pain on the inside that we won't be able to cope with it. And then we start trying to do things to alleviate that. Right? And that's the wicked cycle the serpent wanted to trap us in. He knows humans weren't created to see death. All he had to do was get his death planted in the earth, and he knew that would subvert our souls. And he knew we would then try to bring peace to our own souls. And he knew if we tried to bring peace to our own souls, we'd become like Paul that said, the good that I want to do, I can't do. And the bad that I don't want to do is the thing I find coming out of me all day long. Oh, wretched man that I am, who shall save me from what? This body of death, he says. Do you see what he's saying there? Death, when it reigns over me, it takes my members captive. And in my mind, I want to love. I want to be full of peace and kindness and joy. But I don't find that's what's coming out of me. In fact, I find the opposite coming out of me. I find myself hating and envying and filled with covetousness. And I find myself filled with all these things. Oh, wretched man that I am, who's going to heal me from this life? And then he says, I thank God through Jesus. And then he says, the Spirit of life has set him free. What spirit of life? The spirit that his life is my life, and his life overcomes death. Therefore, the death I see in this world can't overcome my life. Right? You guys follow that?
Yep.
And what Paul is talking about there? Death was reigning. You know, when Paul talked about his sin being covetousness, he wasn't talking about lusting after women or prostitutes. See, we all sit with our own definition of covetousness. What Paul was saying is, I was lusting after a good report through the good I could accomplish in the world. I was lusting after life through the world. I thought if I could be the greatest Pharisee of all Pharisees, if I could become the high priest, if I could exalt myself by my good works, then that would give me life. See, he was coveting life through his flesh, through the world. Now, that caused him to be filled with hatred, bitterness, envy, backbiting, murder, gossiping, all those kinds of things. Everything that ails us comes from us thinking we lack life, we lack a good report, and then we try to do something to satisfy that lack. Right? Like for me, the serpent, my sin was covetousness. I was little, and I was innocent, and I could just run like a maniac. And next thing I know, I could run better than everybody else could run. And I had all these scholarships lined up and all these people wanting to come see a 10-year-old kid run. All these Olympics and international meets, high schools wanting to pay my tuition to come there and run. I had all that going on, but I was running innocently. But then when I got all that attention, the serpent convinced me my value was found in my running. I have a good report of my life now because of my running. Now, what do you think happened the moment I couldn't run anymore? I felt like I lack a good report.
Yes.
I lack life. I'm a loser. Now, I tried to overcome that with my works, like my good deeds, for a while. But it was futile. And eventually, as I saw the futileness, and I saw I couldn't heal myself through my good works, but eventually I became so run down by that feeling of I lack a good report, I lack life, I couldn't take it anymore. I had to do something to try to save my soul, and that's when I started getting high. Right? I was trying to bring myself rest from the pain I felt from thinking that I was no good, that I wasn't acceptable to God or people. Look at me. How could I be acceptable? I'm a failure. I never reached my potential. I blew it. And then, after I started getting high, that compounded the problem. Because then the problem grew. Look at all the potential you had, but you got high instead. More death, more lack. Right? You guys follow that cycle? Now listen, I'm talking about myself, but something similar like that has happened to all of us at some point in our life. And that's the thing that ails us. And God's trying to rip out that word of lack, or that word that you're separated from life, that you're separated from a good report. The way that He does it, or His arm, or His strength to do it, is Christ and Him crucified. And so when we speak the sacrifice, we're declaring the Lord's death in our life till He comes. And that's what communion is about. Hopefully that made some sense. I know we went all over the place and connected a lot of things, but I encourage everybody to go back and listen to that and ask God to show you this in your life. Because He'll give you discernment. You'll see the root that's been bringing you pain. So many times we don't see the root, we see the fruit. And then we try to fight the fruit instead of the root. And so we clean up the fruit for a little while, but then the root that brought forth the bad fruit is still there.